Someone, somewhere, right now, is doing the maths in their head. Not the kind with numbers exactly, more the kind where you line up where you are in life next to where you thought you would be by now, and the gap between the two feels uncomfortably wide. Maybe it happens at a reunion, seeing an old friend who bought a house or had a child or got the kind of job that used to feel like a shared dream. Maybe it happens alone, scrolling past someone's announcement at midnight, someone younger, someone who seems to have figured out something you are still searching for. And something quiet shifts in your chest. Not quite grief, not quite envy, something harder to name than either of those. That feeling has a way of arriving without warning and staying longer than it should. What we are really talking about today is the experience of feeling behind. Not behind on a task or behind on sleep, but behind in the larger sense, behind in life, behind on some invisible schedule that nobody handed you, but that you somehow feel accountable to. And the reason this is worth sitting with carefully is that it is one of the most common, least talked about sources of quiet suffering in adult life. People carry it for years. It shapes decisions, relationships, how much risk someone is willing to take, how generously they see themselves. And yet, because it lives mostly on the inside, it rarely gets named for what it is. So let us name it. The feeling of being behind in life is not a factual assessment. It is a psychological experience, and a deeply social one. And understanding where it actually comes from can change the way you carry it, even if it does not immediately make it disappear. There is a concept in psychology called social comparison, and it is one of the most fundamental things the human mind does. We are wired to look at the people around us and gauge where we stand. This is not vanity or weakness. It goes much deeper than that. For most of human history, understanding your position within a group was genuinely important. It influenced access to resources, to safety, to belonging. The brain that noticed where it stood in the social world was the brain that could respond to that information and adapt. So the impulse to compare is not a flaw. It is ancient and it is structural. But here is where things get complicated for people living in the modern world. For most of human history, you compared yourself to the people you could actually see. Your village, your neighborhood, your extended family, a manageable group. Now the comparison pool is essentially unlimited. You are not measuring yourself against the people in your immediate community. You are, in any given scrolling session, measuring yourself against thousands of people, many of whom you have never met, whose highlight reels are curated and filtered and selectively timed. The scope of comparison has expanded in a way the brain was simply never built to handle. And when comparison is that wide, the chance that someone will always appear to be further ahead than you approaches certainty. It is almost mathematically unavoidable. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the feeling of being behind often carries an implicit accusation, a sense that something has gone wrong with you specifically, that other people are progressing on schedule and you are the exception. But the research on social comparison consistently shows that almost everyone, across age groups and life circumstances, engages in upward comparison and experiences its sting. The person who seems to be ahead of you is almost certainly measuring themselves against someone else who makes them feel exactly the same way you feel right now. The question worth asking is not whether you are behind, but behind according to what? Because when you trace it back, the timeline most people feel they are failing to keep up with was not one they consciously chose. It assembled itself from a collection of signals absorbed over years, what your parents seemed to expect, what your peer group appeared to be doing, what the cultural narrative around you said adulthood should look like by 30 or 40 or 50. Career milestones, relationship milestones, financial milestones. These signals land early and they stick, and the mind stores them not as suggestions, but as something closer to a schedule, one that runs quietly in the background and issues a kind of alert whenever the gap between expectation and reality becomes visible. Think about what this actually looks like on an ordinary day. Someone gets a promotion and does not feel the satisfaction they expected because the promotion arrived later than they thought it should have. Someone starts a business they are genuinely proud of, but finds themselves pulling back from talking about it because they started it in their 40s and feel some low hum of embarrassment about that. Someone falls in love with the right person and spends the first months waiting for the joy to be uncomplicated, but it keeps getting tangled up in a nagging sense that this chapter should have started earlier. The life event is real and often good, but the experience of it gets filtered through this invisible timeline and something is lost. There is also something worth saying about how being in this state affects behavior over time, because the feeling of being behind is not just uncomfortable. It can become quietly self-perpetuating. When someone feels chronically late to their own life, they often do one of two things. Some people accelerate. They start making rushed decisions, leaping at options not because the options are right, but because the urgency inside them demands movement. Others slow down in the opposite direction. The gap feels so large that starting feels futile. Neither of these is a conscious choice exactly. They are responses to an emotional state that the mind has not yet found a way to sit with. Psychologists sometimes describe this second pattern as a form of avoidance that masquerades as acceptance. It looks like calm from the outside, but it is actually paralysis. And the quietly painful part is that waiting to feel less behind before you begin something rarely works, because the feeling of being behind does not lift when you stay still. It tends to grow. There is also something that rarely gets said about all this, which is that the timelines we feel held to are not neutral. They were built in a specific historical and cultural moment, and they do not fit everyone. They were built around particular kinds of bodies, particular kinds of families, particular economic circumstances, particular ways of moving through the world. Plenty of people feel behind, not because they have failed to keep pace, but because the pace was never designed with them in mind. Recognizing that is not making excuses. It is accurate. Before anything else shifts, the most useful thing is usually just to get some clarity about whose timeline you are actually on. Not as a rhetorical exercise, but as a genuine question. If you stripped away what you absorbed from your family, your culture, your social feed, what would your own honest sense of a meaningful pace actually look like? Most people, when they sit with that question, find that the answer is quieter and more personal than the one they have been trying to keep up with. This is also a good moment to say, gently, that if the feeling of being behind is persistent and affecting how you function day to day, talking to a therapist or counselor is worth considering. This kind of reflection is a starting point, not a substitute for that kind of support. The small shift that tends to help most is not reframing your situation into something it is not. It is not telling yourself you are exactly where you are supposed to be, because that may not land as true, and hollow reassurance tends to make things worse, not better. The shift is something smaller. It is learning to distinguish between the emotional experience of feeling behind and the factual question of what your life actually contains right now. The feeling is real. The schedule it is measuring you against may not be. When people start to separate those two things, even partially, something tends to ease. Not because the circumstances change, but because the judgment attached to the circumstances begins to loosen. And when that happens, there is sometimes room for something that was not there before. A clearer sense of what you actually want rather than what you feel you should already have. The people who seem least troubled by questions of being behind are not typically the ones who are furthest ahead by any conventional measure. They tend to be the ones who have quietly made peace with the idea that their life has its own shape, and that shape does not need to match anyone else's to count as something real and worth building. That peace is not complacency. It is a different kind of orientation toward time, one that runs toward something rather than away from a gap. That is a thing that can be practiced, slowly, imperfectly, without any dramatic turning point to mark when it began. If any of this settled somewhere for you, we put something new here every day. It would be good to have you back tomorrow.